Thank you all for joining us today for this Legal Epi at Lunch session. Today we're going to be talking about local policy surveillance, and I'm very excited that two of our guest speakers will be talking a little bit about their experience leading local policy surveillance projects today. So it'll be really nice to have their insight and perspective on this topic. Katie Moran McCabe and Ross Silverman will be talking with you a little bit today. But before we do that, I will introduce myself and kind of go over policy surveillance really briefly for those of you who may not be familiar, or if a refresher would be helpful. My name is Alex Hess. I'm the legal training manager at the Center for Public Health Law Research. And this session is part of our advanced topics in policy surveillance or legal epidemiology series. So we also have our introduction to policy surveillance as well, which is, I believe, every other month. Our next session will be September 12th. So if you haven't already had the chance to join one of those sessions, I definitely encourage you to if you're new to policy surveillance. But this is part of our advanced sessions and kind of covering specific topics in policy surveillance. So today we'll be talking more about local policy surveillance, which I'm really excited to talk about. And if you didn't already hear, I know some of you are still joining us, we will have some time at the end for questions. So if you'd like to ask questions in the Q&A, please do so, and we will get to those at the end. But before we get started, I wanted to, again, just quickly cover policy surveillance. So this wheel, which you may have seen before, represents the policy surveillance process from start to finish. And it's a wheel and not a straight line, because we like to say that this work is very iterative. So oftentimes as we're going through the process, we have to revisit steps that we've already completed. And this is all in an effort to refine the process and refine our scope to really ensure that our data is accurate and reliable and also replicable. And so I'll quickly cover some of these steps just so you have an idea of what this process looks like, because this is really the same process that can be applied to any type of policy surveillance project, including local policy surveillance. So we start with defining the scope, and that's really where we begin thinking about why we're creating this data in the first place. What's the importance? Who, if anyone, has already done this work before? Are we trying to fill any gaps in research to really understand this policy area? What jurisdictions are you interested in looking at? What's your time frame? Are you interested in understanding the state of this particular policy area as it is now? Are you trying to get an understanding of how it's maybe changed over the past 10 years, for example? So defining the scope is where we start really getting an idea of what the parameters for your data set look like. And then we move on to conducting background research. So that's really getting a solid understanding of what this policy landscape looks like, right? What is happening on the ground? What are maybe some trends in policy in recent years that we want to have a good understanding of? And also at this step, we kind of get a sample set of some of the policies and what they look like in any particular jurisdiction, so that we know when we move on to doing this research, we know what to look out for. We know how some of these policies are constructed. And then from there, we move on to developing our coding questions. So if you haven't already gotten a chance, I encourage you to visit lawatlas.org or pdaps.org. I'll share those websites with you in just a moment, but that's where our data is housed, and the data that our project partners who use policy surveillance often publish their projects as well. So if you haven't already, I would recommend you check out our publicly accessible data on one of those pages, and that's where you'll see an interactive map and also our question and answer set, which is really the framework for every data set that is using policy surveillance uses. So we develop our coding questions in terms of thinking about what are the particular variables we're interested in capturing, what are the areas of these policies that we really care about and want to get an understanding of, and that we want to know how they vary from one jurisdiction to the next. So the question and answer set that we create as part of our developing coding questions process is really what structures our data set. And then from there, we move on to collecting the law, creating the legal text, and that's the process of going jurisdiction by jurisdiction, identifying the relevant laws and policies within our project scope, and then finally moving on to coding the law. We use software called Monocle to do that. But ultimately, this is where developing your coding questions and collecting that legal text comes together. You're doing the meat of this work and creating that data by going jurisdiction by jurisdiction and answering those questions you created based on the policy text that you identified as relevant and in scope for your project. And then from there, we publish and share that data, and then oftentimes many of our data sets will be tracked and updated over time. So just a high level idea of what policy surveillance is and what this process is if you're not already familiar. And again, like I mentioned, I recommend checking out our Introduction to Policy Surveillance session next month if you're interested in learning more about this process. And this is the end product, legal data that can be used for evaluation. So this is something that's produced along with every data set that we create, and that's available on Law Atlas as well, downloadable in CSV format, as well as the codebook, which is used in tandem with the data to really understand what the data means. So it includes the question type, the variable name, and the values and their labels. And like I mentioned, we publish our data sets to either lawatlas.org or pdaps.org. Law Atlas is home to 125 freely available public health legal data sets. And then pdaps.org, funded by NIDA, is where you can find data sets specifically tracking drug policy. So in thinking about this, I want to come back to local policy surveillance, what we're talking about today, and why it's any different from any typical policy surveillance project, and how it varies. And I think there's some key differences. For one, when we're at our scoping phase, considering the differences between intrastate versus interstate data, right? What might be some of the challenges or benefits of conducting policy surveillance within one particular state versus conducting policy surveillance across the US, for example, right? Like, is it more of value to collect policies within a singular state versus thinking about other localities that maybe are demographically similar to the jurisdiction you're interested in comparing, for example. Consider other unique research challenges like how available and accessible local policies are. I think this is a logistical challenge that shouldn't be underestimated. It can be really difficult to identify laws and policies at the local level. So thinking about logistically how easy or difficult that might be is another consideration when thinking about doing this work. And also understanding things like the relationship between state and local law and policy. So consider something like preemption, right? State level preemption of local laws and how that might really impact your research and your coding, right? Are you going to have to collect maybe some state level policy as well? Thinking about things like home rule and Dillon's rule and whether local governments have broad discretion to govern a particular policy, or whether that's impeded by state law and whether that should be factored in to your project as well. So thinking about some of these considerations, I think, is really important at the outset, and it'll definitely have an impact on how you conduct policy surveillance at the local level. And I think maybe some of our speakers might be able to speak to some of these challenges today. And then really quickly, before I turn it over to them, I wanted to highlight one project that has been completed using policy surveillance at the local level, and that's the City Health Project. And this is an initiative of the de Beaumont Foundation in partnership with Kaiser Permanente, but it's using policy surveillance to collect policies for 75 of the largest cities in the US using a 12 policy package. So again, it's created using policy surveillance, and this process is using local level policies and assessing them to get an understanding of their adherence to this policy package. And they take it a step further and award medals to the cities that adhere to these policies based on the standards that they've outlined. So I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But I think this is a really unique project using policy surveillance at the local level and using a ranking system to really determine which cities are enacting these public health forward policies. So this is just a screenshot of the medals that have been awarded to some of the cities in the US. You can clearly see based on their coding scheme how each of the cities was awarded a medal. And to award medals, our team at the center and other evaluation partners, again, performed policy surveillance based on the criteria that they established for each policy. So these medals are awarded for high achieving policies. Those get the gold medal, good policies, which get silver medals, and acceptable policies, which get bronze medals. And cities that don't have a policy or policy that doesn't meet those minimum requirements receives no medal. And you can also find important information about the relevant county and state level laws impacting city policy adoption on City Health's website as well. So I definitely encourage you to check this out if you haven't already. And you can view each individual policy area and see which cities were awarded which medals within each. So I think that's really nice. And then when you click on that, you can see how they awarded those medals. So what were the criteria? And this is the Affordable Housing Trust medal. So some of the criteria they use for whether a city has established an affordable housing trust fund, whether the city has a policy including multi-stakeholder oversight board, whether it identifies or establishes a dedicated revenue source to fund the trust. So here you can clearly see how they've outlined the criteria for achieving each individual medal for this particular policy. So I think this is a really great project that highlights the use of policy surveillance at the local level to do something really transformative and to rank each of these cities based on their adherence to some of these policies. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Katie. But before I do that, I just wanted to quickly introduce you all to her. She's the lead law and policy analyst here at the center, where she conducts legal research and leads projects on a variety of policy areas related to public health. Much of Katie's work has focused on housing policy. She has managed the creation of multiple data sets built using scientific legal mapping methods, including the state and territory eviction laws and city nuisance property ordinances data sets. And Katie also led the development of the Sentinel Surveillance of Emerging Laws and Policies legal mapping method and assisted in managing the creation of the local eviction laws data set. So we will hear a little bit from Katie now.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. I'm really happy to be here to talk a little bit about our local eviction laws data set. Next slide. So the research that I'm going to be talking about today was funded by the Legal Services Corporation, and the views that I am presenting do not necessarily represent the views of LSC. Next slide. So I wanted to start with just a little background for some context on this. So most of you probably know that there is a huge eviction problem in the United States. And one of the big issues at the root of this is the lack of affordable housing. So as reported by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, nearly 50% of wage earners cannot afford a one-bedroom home at fair market rent while working one full-time job. The Eviction Lab at Princeton University has estimated that landlords file 3.6 million eviction cases each year in the United States. And eviction has been associated with poor public health outcomes and also disproportionately affects people of color, women, and children. Next slide. So in an effort to address the eviction crisis in the US, LSC embarked on a study that was directed by Congress to investigate the unmet legal needs related to eviction. There are a lot of laws that govern the eviction process. but there's really not much that's known about the ways that these laws affect the likelihood of eviction filings and evictions themselves. So this study draws on three main resources. First is a database on eviction laws and procedures. Second is a database of state court case records that were gathered from jurisdictions across the country. And then third is data from legal aid programs that was collected via surveys and focus groups. Next slide. So our team at the center partnered with LSC to create the legal database part of this project, which consists of one data set that covers all 50 states, DC, and 8 territories, and then one data set covering eviction laws in 30 US cities. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Next slide. So I'll say just a few words about the methods that we use to create the data set first. Next slide. So we use the policy surveillance process, which Alex talked about just a few minutes ago. So I won't go through all of these steps, but this is the process that we used, again, focusing with an emphasis on quality control, transparency, and replicability. Next slide. So as far as the scope of this data set, it includes the key features of eviction laws that were in effect as of January 1st, 2021 in 30 US cities. Some of the key elements that were captured in the data set include the reasons that the law dictates for why a landlord can evict a tenant. It also includes notice requirements prior to eviction, the judicial process for eviction, as well as regulations controlling the physical execution of an eviction. As far as the types of laws, the data set includes statutes, regulations, local ordinances, and court rules that specifically govern evictions. And it also includes those same types of laws that govern general civil procedure that's relevant to the eviction process. And I'll highlight here that for this data set, we did not limit the scope to municipal laws only. So we did include state laws and county laws that applied in the city as well, because we wanted to get the full picture of what the law was in that city, as opposed to just knowing what the local law said, if there was one. We did not include case law for the data set unless it directly affected a statute or regulation that was in scope. And we also did not include court orders. There are other inclusion and exclusion criteria. We don't have time to cover all of those today, but you can find all of those details in the research protocol, which I will talk about on the next slide. So as Alex mentioned briefly in the beginning, there are several resources that are published with the data set, one of which is the research protocol. So this outlines the entire methodology of the project, including the data collection methods, search strategy, databases used, coding methods, so the rules that the research team used to code the questions, as well as a description of quality control measures. The protocol also includes details about the scope of the project, so the dates, jurisdictions, the types of law that were included, as well as the variables that were coded. And all of this is really important to ensure that the process is transparent and replicable. Okay, next slide, please. So Alex mentioned the data and code book, which are also published with the data set. So this is just a snapshot of the data file and the code book from the local evictions data set. Next slide. So the data set can be explored in a couple of different ways. First, through interactive maps. So it can be queried by variable. So you can select one or more of the coded variables and then see on the map which jurisdictions meet that criteria. You can also query by jurisdiction. So you can click on a city and then see what the responses are for all of the coding questions for that particular city. Next slide. And then in addition to the data appearing in a map, there's also a table for the data set that appears on the homepage just under the map. So you can, again, select as many variables as you want, and then the cities that meet those criteria will show up in a table just underneath the map. So here we're looking at cities where there is a law regulating residential evictions, and where the law directly regulates the amount that a landlord can charge as a fee for late rent. So here you can see each of the jurisdictions that meet that criteria. And then you also see that section symbol, so in that green box on the slide, and that links to the citation as well as the full text of the law for each response. So users can see the actual legal text that was used to code that particular variable. Next slide. All right, so that's just a bit about the methods and the data set resources. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the results. So as a reminder, we're looking at laws that were in effect as of January 1st, 2021. Next slide. So in all 30 cities that were included in the study, there is a law regulating residential evictions. And you can see those cities here on this map. Next slide. So Alex talked a little bit about preemption as a consideration when doing a local data set. And for this local eviction data set, we did decide to include a question about preemption. So we asked if there was a state or territory law preempting local eviction laws. And of the cities that we studied, 9 of them are in a state where there was a state law preempting local eviction laws. So we coded this variable if the state law preempted any element of local regulation of eviction proceedings, except we did not code preemption if the law preempted the local regulation of rent control policies only. But if it was broader than that or regulated another element of the eviction process, we coded that preemption variable. Next slide. These 3 cities that you see here, so Seattle, Sacramento, and Los Angeles, require that landlords have a just cause to terminate a tenancy at the end of the lease. So landlords must have a reason that was specified in the law in order to evict a tenant. Next slide. This chart shows the range of fees that landlords have to pay in order to file an eviction. So for the cities studied, the filing fees ranged from $30 to $297, with most of the cities falling somewhere in that $41 to $80 range. So you can see there were 14 of the 30 cities that fell in that range. Next slide. Different jurisdictions have different requirements for how much notice a landlord has to give before terminating a tenancy. There were 13 cities that are shown on the map here where landlords have to give 3 days notice before terminating a tenancy for non-payment of rent. And this was the most common time frame for the cities studied. Next slide. And then there were 2 cities, Cleveland and New York, where the law provided a right to free legal counsel for tenants in eviction proceedings. A reminder, though, that the laws included here were those as of January 1st, 2021. And there have been states that have enacted right to counsel laws since then. So if you're interested, you can visit the National Civil Right to Counsel website for information on those laws. Next slide. So that's just a brief overview of some of the findings, and I'll show you in just a minute how you can access the data set to explore it further. But let's just talk for a minute about, now that these data exist, what happens with them? What do we do now? So LSC is wrapping up their study this year and will be releasing a final report. But there are several opportunities for using the data for analysis alongside some of the other components of their study. So, for example, LSC created the eviction tracker, which is an interactive online tool that provides access to data on eviction filings in the United States. So it currently has data for over 1,250 counties and municipalities, as well as 30 states and territories. So potentially some of that data could be analyzed in connection with the laws database to evaluate the impact that laws have on eviction filings. LSC also released a report using the data from the state level legal data set that we created to analyze the speed and the cost of evictions for non-payment of rent. Their analysis found that overall the eviction process in the United States moves quickly, and it's relatively cheap for landlords to file for eviction. So in about 70% of the states, the minimum time between when a tenant is served with an eviction summons and the date of the eviction hearing is pretty short. It's range from 2 to 13 days. And as far as cost, the analysis found that 22 states, in 22 states, the minimum eviction filing fees were below $100, with 12 of those states having a minimum fees below $50. So this report is helpful in understanding the impact that these laws may have on people who are being evicted. Similar analysis could be done using the local data. And both of these resources can be found on the LSC website at the address on the bottom of the slide. Next slide. So we encourage you to explore the data set. Here's where you can find the data and more information on LSC's eviction study. So the QR code on the left will take you to the homepage for LSC's eviction study. And then the QR code on the right will take you to the dataset homepage on lawatlas.org. Next slide. So that's all I have. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions, you can also visit the center's website or follow us on social media. And I will look forward to answering any questions towards the end of the webinar. So thanks so much, and turn it, I guess, over to Ross. We're back to Alex.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Ross now, but thank you for that presentation. All right, so like Katie mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A and she'll be able to answer them at the end. But before that, I am excited to hear from Ross Silverman, who is a professor of health services administration and policy and associate dean for faculty affairs at Temple University College of Public Health. He holds a secondary appointment as a professor at the School of Law and is a member of the Temple Center for Public Health Law Research. His work focuses on public health, population health, healthcare technology, and healthcare law, policy, and ethics. And he's particularly interested in how these areas affect the health and well-being of vulnerable populations. He frequently teaches and speaks on issues related to interprofessional health education, negotiation, and dispute resolution. Professor Silverman serves as an associate editor for legal epidemiology for the journal Public Health Reports. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for allowing me to share our experience in working on issues of local policy surveillance. This is a project that began and ran pre-COVID and into the pandemic. The title is based around two things. One is you probably, many of you are probably familiar with the phrase from the former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who said all politics is local. That was followed in the SARS outbreak by a statement made by Julie Gerberding, at that time the head of the Centers for Disease Control, who stated that all public health really is local. And we saw this play out in very bold relief, I think, during the course of the COVID pandemic, as there began to be a great amount of tension between local jurisdictions, states, and to some degree the federal government in how to manage public health response to that infectious disease outbreak. So we were really interested in getting involved in looking, while I was at Indiana University, at local public health laws in the state of Indiana. And so the picture that you see here is of the records room in a county government office that we found ourselves spending a full day in as we were scanning documents to include as part of our study. If we could change to the next slide. What we got involved with is, and I've put into the chat a link to the article that we published in the journal, the American Journal of Public Health, that my presentation today is based around. The project was what we called the Indiana Addictions Law and Policy Surveillance Project. We were given funding by Indiana University as part of what they called their Grand Challenges program. Indiana University saw the response to the opioid epidemic as a key area that it wanted to investigate and try to leverage research and data in order to bring about best practices for response across the state of Indiana. And so we received funding that we thought was going to be a fairly straightforward lift. We were going to collect up and then analyze the state and the local laws and ordinances associated with substance use across the state of Indiana, with an idea similar to what was discussed by Alex with the city health, and I think also as part of the evictions project. I think one of the great powers of doing this type of work, we were specifically going to use the state of Indiana as our whole, and then do an interstate comparisons across jurisdictions. That ability to map differences across jurisdictions and then share what might be the evidence-informed policies or the best practices to other jurisdictions is a powerful way to leverage law data in the policy arena, as you can work with local law passing bodies to try to get them to adopt the more evidence-informed or evidence-based approaches. If you can change to the next slide. What we found, though, when we began our project was, if you recall back to the chart that both Katie and Alex referred to, one of the assumptions is that you're going to have holistically accurate and up-to-date data available to you in order to then dig down into your particular topical area. What we found ourselves up against as we started off in this project was that there wasn't a data set available. So a lot of our project ended up centering around creating the data set itself. What we found is that a huge swath of the counties in our state did not have their data, meaning their ordinances, available and up to date online. Indiana has 92 counties. It has a complicated history of home rule. We have systematically underfunded local governments, and wide variations in demography, geography, and technology adoption. So how those different localities chose to store and organize their laws complicated our engagement in policy surveillance. Under Indiana law, county governments can fulfill their obligation for publishing and recording and maintaining their permanent record of local laws by keeping official copies of what is passed by their local councils in a book in their offices. Furthermore, unlike state statutes, most counties don't organize their local ordinances by subject matter. They organize them topically, or they organize them chronologically, but based upon the date that the law ended up getting passed. So we found ourselves with a data acquisition problem in order to right from the get-go. If you change to the next slide. So unlike with Westlaw and Lexis, if you were to do a 50-state survey, you can make an assumption that that law database is going to be complete. That all 50 states are going to have the state laws, at least up to, if you wanted to stop at the previous year, you could go up to, that were passed through the last legislative session, and you could make sure that the start and stop dates were going to be available for all 50 of your jurisdictions. There isn't something similar available for county and or city jurisdictions. So this is a look into Municode, which is probably the most comprehensive source for local law. And you can see that, that it has a combination in here of both county and municipality information, but it's pretty scant. Next slide. So what we found is we wanted to look at all 92 counties and the law that also was available in the 20 most populous cities in the state, so that we could have the substance use related laws available for the vast majority. It ends up covering about 92% of all residents of the state of Indiana. So this flow diagram shows you the process we needed to go through in order to acquire a data, the raw data, before we could even start narrowing down to looking for substance use related data. So first we had to see if the code was available in an online code library, and we found that in 42 jurisdictions. We then looked, if it wasn't available there, we had to look to the jurisdiction's website. We found another 37 jurisdictions had the information available on their website. In 23 of those jurisdictions, we found the information was codified by topic. In 19 of the jurisdictions, we were able to parse it out by individual PDFs. But if the information wasn't available in the jurisdiction's website or available in these online code libraries, then we would reach out to contact the counties themselves. And we found that the most reliable partner in doing this research was the county auditor's office. They seem to keep the most up-to-date records of anyone within county government. For 9 counties, or for 6 of the counties, they shared their electronic files with us. We ended up sending them a jump drive, and then they would send us back all of their data. 5 counties sent us an index of their ordinance titles so that we could then pick out the ordinances that might be of most relevance to our research. And then in another 18 of the counties, we ended up having to go to the offices of the auditor and scan the documents into electronic form ourselves. Because most of the auditors, they're elected officials, they don't have all of the documents available in electronic form in their computers. The official record is the published. Oftentimes, it's a 3-ring binder. So if you change to the next slide, you can see the room where it happens. So on the left, you can see here what we would find are these binders like this that we would have to, many times each ordinance was in its own plastic sliding divider, like you might find in a middle school paper is submitted in. We'd have to take the ordinance out of the paper, take out the staples, and then we ran each of these documents through a scanner that we carried with us onto when we would travel the hundreds of miles around the state to gather these ordinances. One of the challenges we have is that this process, you can't just sort of sit down with these documents, read everything from front to back, flag the relevant documents, and then start unstapling and restapling. Most of the time we would have 1 day, maybe 2 days that were available for us to gather the information. So what you have to do is collect it all and then bring it back to the office and start sifting and organizing that way. So we ended up burning out our first scanner. We ended up scanning over 25,000 individual pages of documents in order to try to collect up the full data set. And this is what was necessary in order for us to find the laws that covered about 30% of all counties in the state of Indiana. Furthermore, another issue that we ran into, while this gave us many of the documents, it may not, we have to realize that one of the limitations we ran up against is that it may not have given us all of the relevant documents. Because we would go back to generally the mid-1980s to collect up substance use related ordinances. But if there was something that was on the books from 50 years ago, that may have been in one of those other binders that you can see in the background. We just had to limit what we could do just based upon the access that we had. And then COVID hit. And so that stopped us from going to a number of jurisdictions because they closed their local government offices. So if we move to the next slide. So so the costs, and this is Lindsay Satter, who is the first author. She was the project director for our project. She was the first author on our article, and she's carrying on her back the scanner and the staple removers and our stapler and all the other gear and the laptop that we would bring with us as we were scanning up all of our documents from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So the costs, this is given the fact that so much of public health is undertaken at the local level, it seems like a real tragedy if you cannot, as a public, easily access the laws that may be impacting your local community related to significant public health issues such as substance use. So the costs that were associated with us to try to do this for just one state, we still have not yet determined how many states are similarly situated to Indiana in having so little of their actual law available online. But I suspect it's quite a large share of other states. So for us, the square one of a typical policy surveillance project was not the typical square one. We had to purchase scanning equipment and portable storage equipment. We had to undertake travel. We had to do all the time and labor of gathering all of this and then sifting the information. It raises some questions about the comprehensiveness of the data that's available. So if we do an analysis, there's certainly going to be significant limitations. And then this database is only going to be good up to a certain date. In order to keep things up to date, you may have to do this type of artisanal updating of going back out to the various jurisdictions or requesting periodic updates from them in order to get this information. It would be fantastic, and what we recommended in our paper is that local laws of all kinds should be available online. Ideally, it would make sense for a place like the Library for the State Supreme Court to be gathering and maintaining all of this, or if there's a state-funded law school, that a place where there could be a central repository of local laws of all kinds. It should be organized and searchable in a consistent manner. Again, as we found, some commercial entities, when they scan the information, they organize it by topic, but they may organize it by topic differently than you might organize it by topic. They may include or exclude certain information, and they may not share what's been excluded or included. And this information should be, given the fact that it's local law, freely and openly accessible. To allow for this would benefit both the public's health as well as democratic engagement in local government. So next slide. So if you want to talk about possibly entering into this world of policy surveillance, I'm happy to chat about that. We did end up doing some analysis of the data that we received down the road, but I can be reached here at ross.silverman@temple.edu, or you can find me available at the various social media sites as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ross, and thank you for really speaking to, I think, a lot of the practical implications that go into this work that I think is easy to underestimate. And I think even these pictures really illuminate how unpredictable it can be, and finding something that you think should be pretty easily accessible, something like local ordinances, for it to require this extent to go to each of these localities. I think you said for 30% of the population in Indiana. It's pretty incredible to think in 2023 that the only place you might be able to find some of this information is in a 3-ring binder. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. If anyone has questions, we do have about 5 minutes left. Thank you to both of our speakers for those presentations. I know I have some questions, but I will see if there's any from our participants. One question I had for you, Katie, is in doing the research for eviction policies at the local level, you said state and county law and policy was also relevant. How did you, I guess, come up with a coding scheme for how you were going to code some of these questions when you had maybe 3 different policy authorities that you had to consider as part of this project?
So one thing that was super helpful was that, so we created the coding questions in collaboration with the team at LSC, and they had an advisory board of experts in housing and eviction related law. So that was really helpful in getting a sense of, sort of variation between state and local laws. So we really, and much of what we found was that much of the law governing evictions is at the state level. There's definitely, a lot of municipal ordinances as well. But we were able to, again, through partnering with the subject matter experts, as well as just doing some background research that the team conducted, we were able to determine that most of the coding questions at the state level would also be useful for the local data set as well.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Well, I don't know. I guess I invite either of you. Do you have any closing thoughts on this process and what your experience has been? I know it sounds like for you, Ross, finding that so much of this policy that you were researching was practically inaccessible, really, I think, kind of had an unanticipated set of findings, and that so much of this, I would assume, is like a problem across the US and not specific to Indiana. So it makes me really think about, how difficult this work can be in comparison to doing something like state level research, where a lot of this is really, you can use Lexis or Westlaw to find really anything. But I don't know, I'm just curious about kind of your hindsight, insight into all of this and what your experience, I think, if there's a way you could summarize this, has been.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a couple different things. One is I think we were really fortunate in that we had received funding from the state or from the state university to do infrastructure building, to build data sets, essentially. That's not something that, is frequent. I think that's also can be a limiting factor in what kinds of questions can be answered through policy surveillance. Is, it's the kind of, why do they rob the banks? Because that's where the money is, kind of a thing. Like, you got to go where the data is available in order to answer questions. This became for us in some ways kind of a democracy advocacy process. I changed institutions, so I haven't been as engaged in the day-to-day process. I have a colleague who's picked up the baton, but working with law librarians, working with the state, with representatives in the state legislature, working with advocacy groups at the local level to try to get this information available online became kind of another, let alone how we were going to store our information and then make it a public database itself, all kind of became spin-off projects from doing this work. But until we have this data available about the local levels, I mean, we really are going to be limited in the kind of questions that we're going to be able to answer about the impact of local law on the public's health.
Yeah, thank you. It makes me think about like the utility in doing policy surveillance at the state level for what the requirements for localities and keeping records are. I'm curious to see how it would compare from one state to the next, maybe. But thank you for that. Yeah, I think it kind of opened up a whole new can of worms, and so it's really interesting to think about the challenges that arise there. I think we're just about out of time, but thank you so much, Katie and Ross. I just wanted to close out with also mentioning that our Policy Surveillance Institute will be taking place October 5th and 6th, so registration is still open for that. Again, our next webinar on the intro to policy surveillance will be next month, September 12th, 11 a.m. Eastern, so please register for that if you're interested. I think that's all I had. I don't know if either of you have any other final closing comments, but thank you again so much to both of you. Thank you all for joining us today for this really interesting conversation on local policy surveillance.